Hi, welcome to the Libertarian Alternative. My name is Mark Selzer, and the Libertarian Alternative is an educational television show brought to your community by the Libertarian Party. Today we'll be talking about feminism, modern feminism, post-feminism, as it relates to libertarian politics with Angela Keaton. Thanks for coming out, Angela. You are a feminist and a radio talk show host.
Yes.
And
I am a libertarian, oddly enough.
And also a member of the National Libertarian Committee, which is the steering committee of 17 people. How many people are on it?
I think it's 17 people, maybe 24 total. We kind of alternates who run the National Party.
Okay. Now, how long have you been a feminist? Your whole life?
Oh.
When did you become aware of this?
You know, actually, I have been a feminist my whole life, but this is actually a complicated story. In my mid-teens, I did go through this very, very dark period, and this was during the 80s when...
Well, it was during the 80s. It was always, everyone had a dark period then.
Unfortunately for me, my adolescence, and this has to do a little bit with sexual orientation matters, you know, coincided with the unfortunate arrival of both Phyllis Schlafly and Andrea Dworkin back on the scene. So I had a very, very miserable time coming into adolescence, given that you had two choices. You had a totalitarian right-winger and a totalitarian left-winger telling women what is natural and what is expected of women and defining their role so sharply. It was other women telling me how to behave.
Right.
It was very unnatural for me because I'd always grown up, I was a very masculine child. Like a lot of libertarian women, this is not uncommon. We were a bit well, no, I mean, there's something that kind of goes hand in hand here. Libertarianism and rationalism, libertarian objectivism, libertarianism and science all do mesh together, and those tend to be somewhat more masculine traits in women. And if you're somewhat of a tomboy growing up, and I grew up in a libertarian
Perhaps.
household,
I think that in the sense that libertarian women are very independent and very assertive, and I think that's very true, although I wouldn't necessarily say that's a masculine trait.
Well, in fair, perhaps you're right, and maybe I'm being unfair, but if we're just kind of looking at things objectively the way the ordinary person does, those traits tend to be a bit more masculine. And if you do have that sense about yourself, when you're being offered these two very, very radical, that seem like they're very radically different.
Who are those people? Explain who these people are to our viewers.
Here's where I came in. I mean, in the 80s, in the 70s and the 80s, you had the Equal Rights Amendment, and you had the Anti-Equal Rights Amendment movement, kind of led up by Phyllis Schlafly, who, at least in the 60s, had some vague pretenses of being kind of a Goldwater Republican, now what we think of as kind of a form of libertarianism. Someone who was basically a constitutionalist, someone who did believe in limited government. And from that perspective, I guess I could understand why you wouldn't want another amendment to the Constitution. However, this came with all sorts of cultural baggage. It had to do with what it meant to be a woman, the role of a wife. It coincided a lot with women coming into the workforce, with lesbianism, with women, well, post-pill, women having sex outside of marriage and even having relationships and children outside of marriage. So it's a very, very complicated bit of anti-legislation, so to speak. This also, in the 80s, you had the anti-porn movement within feminism. Feminism has had many different schools, maybe 15 different schools. When I was in Austin, I did a show called Stages on cable access, and one of the things we did, one of our tasks was to sit and chart every kind of feminism perhaps we could figure out in the 20th century. And I came up with about 15 different schools. I mean, there's Marxist feminism, womanism, radical feminism, which is different, let's say, from Marxism, or different from, let's say, separatist lesbianism, or gender feminism really is the issue here. That was the school that had become most dominant at the universities. And a large part of gender feminism dealt with women were very naturally, well, basically naturally less sexual. It was a really strange return to Victorianism. But you had a lot of lesbians and a lot of hardcore feminists on campus signing on to this. And part and parcel of this was the anti-porn movement.
Right.
They thought pornography was inherently degrading to women. The problem for me was, and here was my conflict, in my early teens, when other girls were interested in boys, I wasn't developing those interests. I was very interested in my math classes and getting through my science classes, and I didn't develop that interest. And then in my later teens, when I did develop interest, they were in other women. So now as I'm coming into my sexual maturity and I'm being told, bombarded with this message that pornography is bad, looking at naked women gives you the masculine gaze of the oppressor.
Uh-huh.
You can't objectify women's bodies. That kind of aggressive sexuality is part of the patriarchy. Needless to say, it was going to be a rocky road for me into adulthood
Right.
when I'm being bombarded with these anti-sex messages.
Yeah, I would, have to say that I completely disagree with the idea that that objectifies people, because I think that part of what makes us human is our very complex and varied sexuality that we show as humans. So I think if you're noticing someone's sexuality, I think that you are humanizing them, because that's a large part of being human. So I disagree with the idea completely that pornography is oppressive to women. And maybe that's a strange point of view, but it's very much almost a post-feminist point of view. Camille Paglia doesn't have as much of a negative idea about pornography.
No.
So later on, this changed, at least with some form of feminism.
And thankfully, now that I was coming into my early adulthood and being honest about my interest in women, Camille Paglia did come to the forefront with Sexual Personae, and that it gave me a certain bit of freedom. But how this intersects with libertarianism is very interesting, because with gender feminism, part of gender feminism is a very, very strong role of the government in the lives of people and in prescribing sexuality. I mean, the sexual harassment laws, the whole sense of getting, criminalizing pornography,
right,
including things as mild as Playboy.
Uh-huh.
So gender feminism was not just an ideological stance. It had actual complications. It had actual considerations for how we behave. In Canada, for example, both Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin were very instrumental in getting these really oppressive, bizarre legislation passed that made these things impossible. And all these things go hand in hand.
Who were those people?
Catherine McKinnon is supposedly a law professor. I say supposedly because even though she is actually a law professor, what she is mostly known for is being a gender feminist. And Andrea Dworkin was a writer and of great note. I mean, she was actually a rather brilliant writer. But her view of both femininity was so prescribed, and her sense of what the role of the government should be was basically totalitarian.
So they passed laws that would abridge freedom of speech in Canada regarding sexual imagery.
But of course, they also got in front of the United States Congress and talked about these things. When you're talking about, there was also the Meese Commission on Pornography and all other issues, and essentially lied. I mean, what McKinnon and Dworkin did was, their research, such as it was patent nonsense. It was mostly just opinions, but when we had a conservative streak in the 1980s, people really wanted to hear that pornography is sick, or that there's something unhealthy about you. Well, I hate the term healthy. It's a value judgment I don't really care for, but that there's something odd about people wanting to see naked bodies. It happens to most of us in our late teens. We have some interest in doing that. It happens sooner or later. And it's good, because if you do believe in traditional marriage, as I do, I think we all do on some level, sex is part of that. I mean, that's how we create families. It's a normal process of human life.
Right. Well, there's certainly the point of view that sex should be there to reinforce a social role, as in marriage, and then marriage becomes the family unit. The family unit is then a unit of the state, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of as if it becomes part of something that reinforces a hierarchy or some kind of social unit that's supposed to be part of the state. I mean, it does seem very controlling, very much part of a prescribed thing. But a lot of people feel very safe in that. A lot of people feel, yes, I like these rules. I don't want you, changing me. I think that's where the resistance comes from.
Those rules are absolutely fine. I have no argument
with that. That's
yes.
not the impression
No.
that people got of feminism in the 70s, and women as well. Women as well got the idea that, wait a minute, I want to stay home and bake cookies, and you're telling me I'm inadequate. And it seems that the tune